Hello, folks, and welcome to The Farm, a podcast dedicated to culture, parapolitics, and high weirdness in all its many forms. This is your host, Recluse, aka Steven Snyder, the longtime curator of the Visa blog and author of A Special Relationship, Trump, Epstein, and the Secret History of the Anglo-American Establishment. If you like what you hear here today, be sure to check me out at visupview.blogspot.com. That's VISUPVIEW, all one word, .blogspot.com. And procure a copy of that book and my other works at the Farm's official store, which is at thefarmpodcast.store. That is the Farm Podcast, all one word, .store. And please consider signing up for the Farm's Patreon. You get 2 additional full-length shows per month. That's between 3 and 4 hours of bonus material with exclusive guests and content. Okay, guys, we've got a repeating guest for today's episode of The Farm. He is the founder of the Coalition Against Voter Disenfranchisement and Election Fraud. He is also the curator of its excellent website, CAVDEF.org, and is presently investigating the mysteries of JonBenet Ramsey's death, the Henry Lee Lucas case, and Ted Bundy, which happens to be today's topic. He's George of CAVDEV. George, thank you so much for dropping by again today, sir.
Thanks for having me. It's just always great to be on the show.
Absolutely. We love you around these parts, George. All right. We are going to get into Ted Bundy in a deep dive kind of way, as I mentioned at the beginning. Bundy is one of the many celebrity serial killers that David McGowan addressed in Program to Kill. Inevitably, there are a lot of strange things surrounding the Bundy case, but Bundy does not seem to have drawn the same kind of attention as some of the other notable serial killers that McGowan's work went into in depth. But George has been working to change that. As we shall see, Bundy is one of the most mysterious of the celebrity serial killers, shrouded in all kinds of sinister implications and connections. So, on that note, let us get going. All right, George, to start off with, let's get into Bundy's origin story. So tell us a bit about his parentage and his youth. And of course, that special moment when he killed his first cat.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the storyline with Bundy, follows the same sort of pattern of a lot of these serial killers, in that their problems seem to be intergenerational in nature. And his family dynamic, starting from his early life, is definitely no exception to that. He was born at an unwed mother's home in Burlington, Vermont, to his mother, Eleanor Cowell, who later went by her middle name, Louise. The identity of the father was somewhat of a mystery. She claimed that she was seduced by a World War II veteran named Jack Worthington, and she initially was planning to give up her newborn son, but eventually her family pretty much convinced her to take him back in, and so she went back to her family's home and basically had this weird arrangement where her parents, Bundy's grandparents, would raise Ted Bundy as if he was their child, and claimed that his mother was actually his sister. So already you have this weird sort of quasi-incestuous seeming kind of relationship in the family. And one of the more disturbing theories about Bundy's parentage is, in fact, that Luis's father, Sam Cowell, actually was the father of Ted Bundy, that it was a case of rape of his own daughter. A couple of family members would later basically speculate to that effect, but there's no doubt that Sam Cowell was a very awful and sort of sadistic man. He was racist, sexist. He was physically abusive towards his wife and towards his children. Threw one of his children down the stairs at one point and did all sorts of awful, unspeakable things to them. He would terrorize animals, like swinging cats around by their tails. And he also seemed to have some kind of underlying mental issues, in that he would be talking to people who weren't actually there, an indication of possible schizophrenia or even a possible dissociative disorder, as we often see in these cases of overlap with abuse and also mind control type of programs. So right from the beginning, a lot of these same sorts of warning signs are there in the family. Now, for whatever reason, Ted Bundy would speak in very glowing terms about his grandfather, had nothing bad to say, said that he really looked up to him as sort of the pinnacle of what a man should be like, and that probably did set the tone for a lot of his subsequent life. He also described how at a very young age he ended up coming across his grandfather's pornography collection. Sam Cowell was very much obsessed with pornography, and Bundy reportedly got into that collection, and he himself became very interested in it.
Just to interrupt, this would have been like around the 50s and 60s, right?
Yeah, Bundy was born in 1946. So
Okay. Just to sort of, I know nowadays porn is, garden variety. I mean, it's, there's no real trouble finding porn in this day and age, but certainly in that particular era, though, I mean, gosh, it sounds like he certainly would have started collecting well before Playboy was founded, for instance. He probably would have had to have really worked to amass a considerable porn collection, because there were some fairly strict laws about that kind of stuff back in the day. So that's really interesting. That certainly does show a certain fanaticism with collecting porn in that particular era.
yeah, no, that's really is an excellent point. That the kind of interest and also potentially connections you would need to get that in the first place are certainly not common of the era, and of course speaks to the type of man that Sam Cowell was as well. And yeah, like I said, Bundy had a very very glowing opinion of his grandfather, who he was told back then was his father, but pretty much no one else in the family shared that. And like I said, even raised suspicions that Sam Cowell was in fact the father of Ted Bundy through rape of his daughter Louise. Now, that was one theory of the parentage. Another theory of the parentage actually came up in FBI documents that were released not too long ago in one of the the vault documents in back in '91, which was a couple years after Bundy was executed on Florida death row. A woman by the name of Janla Carr, that's Carr, basically said that her father, Thomas Dowling Carr, was Ted Bundy's father, who went by the name Jack Worthington, was in the area at the time. She gave a whole accounting of this to FBI interrogators, basically said that, uh, pretty much said that actually her father, Thomas Dowling Carr, still maintains some level of a relationship and association with Louise from time to time, and even visited her occasionally in Pennsylvania, even after she had moved away to Tacoma, Washington, which took place several years after Bundy's birth. That she was a presence in her life known by Aunt Eleanor. She basically claimed that her father went by the name of Lloyd Nelson and also by Jack Worthington. That he had letters from Louise that were addressed as such. They had an army jacket with the surname of Nelson, which is rather interesting because at one point between Ted Bundy's birth and Ted Bundy and Louise moving out of her family home in Philadelphia to go to Tacoma, Washington, and sort of start a new life. At one point, she just abruptly changed her surname from Cowell to Nelson, and there was no real indication of where the surname Nelson came from. But if it had something to do with her liaison that resulted in Ted Bundy's birth in the first place, then what Jan LaCar was saying about her father using the name Lloyd Nelson certainly fits very well. Now, Jan LaCar made claims that that she was around Bundy at certain points during the time that they were both young. That there were occasionally visits between her family and between Louise and Ted, and that she saw him in his youth. She claimed that she witnessed Bundy doing some sadistic things, like at one point pushing a child in the path of a train, who then got killed. She claims to then run into Bundy again a couple years later in his teen years, and at this point, Louise had moved away to Tacoma, Washington, had met a former military veteran by the name of Johnny Culpepper Bundy, and she basically married him and changed the family name to Bundy. So that's where Ted Bundy came from. And at a certain point in Bundy's teen years, he reportedly stole a car in Tacoma and drove it all the way back out to, I believe, Pittsburgh, and ended up seeing, and so Janla claimed to have seen Bundy there again, and then she claimed to have seen Bundy once again in 1969 at Temple University, and Bundy had been back there in Pennsylvania attending Temple University, and she claimed to have seen him at a party where he confessed to even more murders that he had been involved in. So there were a lot of Janla's story is very interesting and does match up with some of what's known about Bundy, and even some of the more obscure facts, like the Nelson surname that Louise Cowell had briefly adopted in her life. Of course, at the same time, it's information that could have been gleaned publicly through sources that were published about Bundy, so it's unclear how much it is verifiable. I will note that she showed the FBI a picture of what her father looked like in 1946, and they did confirm that he bore a resemblance to Bundy. That was the opinion of the FBI interrogators who were interviewing her then. And ultimately, the way that she also claimed that both her father and Ted Bundy practiced hypnotism, which is also rather interesting in light of some of the suspicions brought up in Program to Kill and elsewhere, that there was some kind of mind control theme in the background of this whole of Bundy's own life and family dynamic. She claimed that her father and Ted Bundy both hypnotized her at various points to forget information about Bundy. Now, the way that the stories of these two people ended was rather bizarre. On January 31st, 1997, she ended up supposedly committing suicide by throwing herself in front of a train. She had before then been staying in mental institutions for years. She had a very strained relationship with her father, claimed he was abusive, but also had him paying for her apartment, so they had some kind of tie or love-hate relationship in a way. But yeah, ultimately she supposedly committed suicide, and then her father, Thomas Dowling Carr, ended up believing that this was the work of some government plot, and he was obsessed with this, believed that high-level political figures had caused the death of his daughter, and he was pretty much ranting and raving and trying to uncover that for a while, and then literally the next year, only one day before the anniversary of his daughter's death, he also supposedly committed suicide, him by gunshot. And so, it's a little bit of a weird side story to the whole thing, but no matter what form of Bundy's ultimate parentage was the truth, whether it was Sam Cowell, whether it was this bizarre Thomas Dowling Carr, there is no doubt that Bundy's early life was filled with this kind of sick and twisted family dynamics. And of course, although information about Bundy's early activities, what he was up to, is hard to verify definitively, there are, of course, many claims from family members about the sick things that he was up to, including at one point threatening his aunt, at a very young age, supposedly, posing knives around his aunt while she was sleeping, and then she woke up and saw him smiling. The claims of torturing local animals, like you claim, and also a number of things in his juvenile record that have, of course, been sealed, so we don't know what they are definitively, but what has been alleged about Bundy includes that he would commit voyeurism, being a peeping Tom, but also commit auto theft, like I said before. So right from the start, Bundy had a very much decidedly mixed upbringing. He didn't exactly have the best role models or the best start in life to begin with, and so he was pretty much going on a path of engaging in various types of depravity right from the start.
So now you're saying that his mother was from the Pennsylvania area then originally, correct?
Yeah, family was I believe Philadelphia based, and yeah, she was up in Burlington, Vermont when she had Bundy, but she ultimately ended up moving back in with her own family to raise him for a couple of years. Then after that, she went out to Tacoma, Washington to pretty much get away from it, and that's when the name Ted Bundy ultimately arose.
The Pennsylvania connection is very interesting. And not to keep beating a dead horse, but obviously Chickasha, Pennsylvania, was the headquarters of the original Sovereign Order of St. John. So there has always been a really strong presence with those types in the Pennsylvania area for many years. Interestingly, too, there was a woman from a town or a city, I think that was a little north of Philadelphia. Maybe it was Reading, Pennsylvania. I can't remember off the top of my head, but her name, she had a lot of aliases, but usually she went by Heidi Ranikin, I believe. And there's very compelling evidence that she was involved in a call girl ring that was operating out of the Watergate office building prior to the famous break-in during the early 1970s, and had potentially entrapped some prominent politicians, both Democrats, but even a few Republicans as well. Of course, there are some very compelling accounts out there that was one of the underlining factors of the Watergate break-in, was to assess possibly who was compromised by Heidi. But her Black Book is really interesting. Her whole family upbringing is also very curious. I believe her father was a German immigrant. Certainly this, he would have come over around the World War II era. So that, raises the possibility as to whether or not he was fleeing from something. I do believe there was also a strange history of sexual abuse, and Heidi certainly became a rather celebrated prostitute, shall we say, renowned
Yeah.
for her skills. So, yeah, it's interesting when you sort of look at some of the characters that turn up in that particular region of the country and where they end up later in life.
Yeah, and let's just say Pennsylvania will come up at least once more in this story, and also a lot of the figures from Watergate, incidentally, were themselves from the Seattle area to begin with. Figures like
Oh, that's
Ewell
interesting.
Croak, who ran the Plumbers, he was a University of Washington alum, and I believe John Ehrlichman, the White House counsel, he was also from Seattle. I think he was actually sort of mentor figure to Croak. So yeah, a lot of the Watergate people do actually originate there, which is rather interesting about the way that
Yes.
similar scenarios keep turning up in correspondence and parallels with each other.
Absolutely. And I mean, just certainly Watergate is so criminally overlooked too. I mean, it's not as sexy as the Kennedy assassination or some of the other deep events from that era, but there's a lot of interesting figures in it, and it does kind of tie together some interesting pieces. But before I forget too, so you mentioned one of Bundy's possible parentage, possible fathers had the last name Carr with the double R. I'm sure a lot of fans out there of Murray Terry and so forth are wondering if you found any connections to Sam Carr and his children who were implicated in the Son of Sam cult.
No, I have not. Believe me, that was one of the first things that crossed my mind as well, but I couldn't find any sort of direct indication of that. I can note that certainly when you talk about Sam Carr and his children, the same kind of love-hate relationship appears to between him and his sons as well. He was also described as abusive, yet his sons would often, still stay with him. They would still, look after him in life, and really couldn't distance themselves from him, even though some pretty horrific abuse was described. And I should note about the Son of Sam case, no one has really raised the question of whether the brothers themselves were the subjects of intergenerational abuse, and that might be part of what steered them in the direction of a cult, of this sort of Son of Sam murder cult that they were all alleged to be involved in. And yeah, not to get too far afield, but yes, I did look into whether there was a family connection there. It's an interesting possibility. Couldn't find one though. And I do also want to give a shout out to Jan Kowalski on the Program to Kill .net forum to be the one who first brought Jan LeCar to my attention. They're the one who found this information. It's very, very interesting side aspect of the whole Bundy story. Whether or not it turns out to be true, it is very interesting allegations worthy of any further investigation, including whether there may be a link to the more infamous Carr family.
Absolutely. And as you said, it is fascinating to see how the intergenerational abuse seems to turn up in so many of the figures in these tales. But okay, so let's get on here to Ted's education. Now, he reportedly went to Stanford for a time. Yes, the one in the Bay Area. But not much is written about that. Can you get into a bit of some of the institutions that he's been linked to prior to the University of Washington?
Yeah, certainly. So after Bundy completed his high school education, first he went to the University of Puget Sound up there in the Seattle area, starting in 1965, and not clear whether he was actually majoring anything yet. Maybe just been going into college to get into college, but he very quickly after that point seemed to develop an interest in Chinese studies, studying and learning the Chinese language, which is, I should note, a rather sort of uncommon interest for anyone, but he seemed very fascinated by it. So he transferred the following year in 1966 to the University of Washington for his first stint there. It would not be his last stint there, but he transferred to the University of Washington to study Chinese. And then the following year, he actually got some sort of scholarship that allowed him to go to Stanford in 1967 for a summer course there. So he was studying Chinese for some time. It's not exactly clear where the interest came from, and he reportedly lost the interest rather quickly. He is said to have never completed his class at Stanford, and then Chinese language studies don't really come up again in his path, his resume. Although I should note that there's little bit of evidence that's come up in law enforcement files that somewhat contradicts that. Basically, the father of one of Ted Bundy's later girlfriends, a man by the name of Dr. Russell Hurst, that's spelled Hirst. He would actually claim to law enforcement, and this was repeated in documents about one of the Ted Bundy summits in November of 1975, that Ted Bundy knew, quote, many foreign dialogues, unquote. So Ted Bundy had apparently been able to pick up a number of foreign languages, not just one foreign language. He knew several of them, which I think may indicate that the stories about the extent to which he didn't really show an interest in continued interest in the topic may not be entirely accurate. And there certainly is no accounting I'm aware of how he would have come to know multiple foreign languages. And of course, it is worth noting that several of these schools that I just mentioned do have a record of association with intelligence operations, the intelligence community. The University of Washington, which I just mentioned, that there are a couple interesting personnel there. One of them is Dr. Roy Prosterman of the law program there, and he did a number of things. He actually wrote sort of the quasi-legal justification for the infamous Phoenix program in Vietnam. Basically came up with it under the sort of humanitarian guise of land reform, agricultural development, and pretty much was one of the main architects of it. And one of his students in the law program was none other than Eagle Krogh, who I just mentioned, the former head of the Watergate plumbers, the unit that was working under Nixon's administration to stop leaks, and that was incidentally filled with CIA personnel. And Krogh himself, although it's very rarely talked about, was himself very strongly linked to CIA operations. There are multiple accounts buried in some of the more alternative Watergate narratives of Krogh, carrying gold bullion to drug lords in the Golden Triangle to pay them off, that he would travel on CIA planes to do this. And this is one of the, that's one of the mysterious characters that come out of the University of Washington. And also, they had a professor in the psychology department, Dr. Donald Dudley, who was known to be involved in MK Ultra. In fact, one of his former patients basically sued him a number of years later for forcing drug experiments on them to try to turn them into a programmed killer. So University of Washington undoubtedly has this history of intelligence involvement. And then, of course, Stanford University, right there in the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area, is in the thick of so many of these weird cults, especially back then at the time in the late 1960s and leading into the early 70s. That there was a doctor there named Dr. Donald Lund, who showed up in multiple serial killer cases from that time, that are talked about in Dave McGowan's book, and was routinely, was basically a supposed defense expert, but actually always delivered testimony that would very strongly favor the prosecution and pretty much railroad his own clients who he was supposed to be helping. There was, of course, the infamous Arliss Perry murder that occurred on the Stanford University campus in 1974, a couple years later, that has allegedly been closed and linked to the security guard back in 2018, although there were conflicting accounts before then that the security guard's DNA had already been tested and was not a match for the DNA found on Arliss. And of course, Maury Terry's work had previously suggested a link between the Son of Sam Colt and Arliss Perry's murder. So just, both of these institutions that Bundy attended and studied foreign languages at were certainly both have the specter of intelligence community involvement, as if they're sort of a preparatory location for people who may be getting into that line of work.
Now, did the University of Washington have ties to the early ARPANET stuff? I can't remember off the top of my head.
I can't remember either. That would not surprise me, though. It's seems like one of the institutions
Yeah.
that certainly would. And yeah, looking it up, it does seem that, yeah, they did. So, wow.
Yeah, that's interesting in light. Obviously, we'll get to this when we get into Utah. But Bundy would also later have ties to another university linked to that. And I should probably point out, I mean, you know, when most people think about these mind control type programs, quote unquote, they usually think of the CIA programs like MK Ultra. But there were a lot of these programs going around, and quite a few of them only were tangibly connected to the CIA, and some none at all. One of the more interesting ones was actually being run by DARPA, and it was tied into the creation of the internet. Essentially, it was based upon behavioral sciences. Essentially, they wanted to use an early version of the ARPANET to compile data on people, to compile personality profiles, to see if they could more benevolently manage society and that type of thing, which incidentally is remarkably like what Cambridge Analytica would do many years later. So yeah, this kind of thing was already kind of baked into the early internet from the beginning. If anybody doesn't believe me, I would recommend checking out Surveillance Valley ASAP. By Yasha Levin, I believe, which is just an absolutely pivotal and great book. But yes,
Yeah.
on that note, though, we need to get back on topic. All right, so how about the Republican Party? Bundy apparently became involved with the Republican Party at a pretty young age. So could you take us through those connections?
Certainly, yeah. Bundy, his sort of first set of stints being involved in college pretty much ended around 1968. He just dropped out, and at the same time, he was starting to become very publicly interested in politics for the first time. And he really rose to some rather improbable heights. Very prominent, amassed a series of very prominent political connections. And I just want to say, of course, there's nothing partisan about any of this. There are other serial killers who have the same political level of political connections to the Democratic Party. John Wayne Gacy being the archetypal example of that. And of course, I believe many people here also recognize that the division between these parties is somewhat of a sham in the first place. But anyway, yes, Ted Bundy had a number of connections to high-level Republican politicians, both in the state of Washington and nationally. In 1968, he was a delegate for Nelson Rockefeller. He actually went to the Republican National Convention in Miami that year as a delegate for him. By some accounts, he also worked on Nelson Rockefeller's campaign in Washington state before then. At the same time, Bundy was also a bodyguard and also the driver for the lieutenant governor candidate Art Fletcher. Was hailed as He was, among other things, hailed as the father of affirmative action, which set him apart from some of the other people in his party. But yeah, Bundy already just in 1968, a college dropout, no real apparent record, that would have been a real, compelling cause to hire him in these capacities, ended up becoming linked to not one but two prominent Republican politicians at the time. And I should note as well that his status of being a bodyguard and a driver for Art Fletcher is somewhat of a parallel to another thing that was going on at the same time down in California. Richard Nixon's had a local campaign, basically someone who was running his local campaign effort in California at the time, and also in 1968, named Alan May, who would later Alan May would later go on to be another important aide to Nixon, another sort of White House counsel figure underneath him. And Alan May had none other than the infamous Philip Arthur Thompson as his driver at the time, even though Philip Arthur Thompson himself had no real qualifications for these political connections. He didn't really have anything other than a rap sheet for violent crimes that he'd been committing. And Philip Arthur Thompson will later go on to be a rather infamous serial killer in California. He murdered Betty Cloyer in 1971, who was a drug informant. He murdered in 1975 a man by the name of Ronald Winter, who was about to testify about illegal weapons trafficking at Mather Air Force Base. In 1980, he ran an apartment in San Francisco with a couple sick friends of his where they would throw satanic parties by certain witness accounts with bowls of cocaine and these rituals, and then a woman who was living there named Valerie McDonald, who was uncomfortable with the whole thing and was being inappropriately propositioned by these men, and ended up vanishing, and it later turned up very brutally murdered. And then after that, Philip Arthur Thompson went to work on the Cabazon Reservation in Indio, California, Southern California, that was home to a lot of CIA-related weapons testing.
This is the one that turns up in the octopus thing, right?
Yeah, that's what Danny Castellaro was looking at. This was where Michael Riconosciuto reportedly was reportedly working to bug the Promise software for CIA espionage purposes. The same reservation. Philip Arthur Thompson was acting security there. And
was he connected to Wackenhunt then? Because I believe it was Wackenhunt that had the facility there, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, it was a joint venture between Wackenhut and the Cabazon tribe, which had been pretty much fallen under the control of this unsavory figure named John Philip Nichols, who was pretty much acting on behalf of the CIA and organized crime.
I think you mean Robert Booth Nichols, actually.
Oh no, there were two Nichols. Which
okay.
Yeah, John Philip Nichols was the tribal administrator, and then there was another guy, Robert Booth Nichols, who was also in the story in another capacity.
Yeah, that doesn't. Robert Booth Nichols was quite a grifter, and a lot of times these guys like to operate around people with similar names to add to the confusion.
Yeah, no doubt. And I mean, Michael Riconosciuto actually supplies another sort of connection.
He was also connected to Washington State. Yeah, I was about to say, yeah.
Yeah, his family originated from there, and I think his father.
He actually knew Fred Lee Krisman, the one bishop in Seattle.
Right. Yeah, I was about to say. I think his father, Marshall Riconosciuto, had something to do with Krisman, and maybe even been connected to the Maury Island UFO incident.
Yeah, he had heard some stories about the Maury Island incidents directly from Krisman. For those of you who are not familiar with this, Fred Lee Krisman was one of the first witnesses for the modern UFO phenomenon. He was there for the Maury Island incident in Washington State, Washington State by Puget Sounds, along with Robert Dahl, I believe, where they reportedly recovered several pieces of slag and that type of thing. Kenneth Arnold was later dispatched by Ray Palmer, famous publisher of Amazing Stories, to investigate this incident, and also two AFOSI officers, or guys who eventually became AFOSI officers, if I remember correctly. This was like right around the time the Army Counterintelligence Corps, where the Army Air Force was separated from the Army proper. Previously, these guys had been Army Counterintelligence Corps, and then they, became Air Force Office of Special Investigation. I think like on the day they died or some weird thing like that. But anyway, Krisman was there for that, and then he later got kind of tied into all these wandering bishop circles. He turns up in the JFK assassination, connected to all that weird stuff going on at Guy Bannister's offices there, the private detective. At least he had associates potentially who were linked into that. So it's a very colorful figure, to put it mildly.
Yeah. Anyway, not to veer too far afield of what we were mentioning, we can go through these connections for a long time. But ultimately, Bundy certainly is interesting that Bundy paralleled what Philip Arthur Thompson was doing at the exact same time, both of them being drivers and potentially and likely offering security as well to pretty prominent political figures who, by all accounts, they had no real business being hired, except for the fact that they may well have both been associates of the intelligence community. Philip Arthur Thompson, I should note, was a hitman for these forces, as his position on the Cabazon Reservation evidence is. He was associated with people like Luis Posada Carriles, the sort of Cuban exile who was involved in a lot of these terrorist plots. And Philip Arthur Thompson undoubtedly had these kinds of CIA connections. And Ted Bundy, of course, just having come out of all of these intelligence-connected universities, it raises another interesting parallel of itself. Now, after Bundy's after Bundy did this in 1968, he started to somewhat pursue an education again. He went to Temple University in Pennsylvania for one semester in 1969. This matches up with when Jan LeCar supposedly ran into him yet again. Then he came back to Seattle after that, and he ended up having a meeting. He ended up meeting this girl named Liz Klopfer, spelled Kloepfer. She was at the time a secretary at the University of Washington Medical School. So once again we have a connection to UW, specifically to their medical field, which of course was steeped in some of these unsavory activities, including mind control, as I mentioned. And Liz herself happened to be the daughter of a doctor from Ogden, Utah. He was part of a very wealthy and prominent family there. He was a member of the LDS Church, as prominent people from that area often are. He's Dr. Russell Hurst, as I previously mentioned. He had a number of prominent connections. He was the city physician of Ogden, so basically the medical examiner, founded a local surgical society. He had a son, incidentally, who spent a year out in Vietnam from 1967 to 1968 as a battalion surgeon for wounded soldiers there. So following in his father's footsteps, and also, being another connection to the Vietnam War, which through connections like the Phoenix program often shows up a lot in the background of any of these serial killer cases. So anyway, around this point, Bundy decided to go back into college. Went to University of Washington again, this time enrolled as a psychology major. So began studying the field of psychology, and of course, members of the psychology department at UWash some of them were directly implicated in these sorts of mind control research programs. So while Bundy was pursuing his degree there, he was also up to a couple other things. He started working at the Seattle Crisis Center, this suicide hotline, basically, in, I believe it was 1971. And when he started working at this, it was part of the sort of like work study internship thing to help support himself through college, and of course had a bit of a parallel to what he was doing in majoring in psychology. When he was there, he ended up meeting a woman by the name of Anne Rule. And Anne Rule, many people will recognize the name because she later went on to be one of the major chroniclers of Ted Bundy. She became rather famous for that because she actually knew this person and was friends with Ted Bundy for years before he turned out to be the perpetrator of the murders that she was writing about. So, she came from a family full of law enforcement people out in Michigan. Her grandfather and her uncle were both sheriffs in Michigan. She had a cousin who was a prosecutor, so she was in law enforcement from the beginning, very interested in the field. She majored in creative writing, but also minored in criminology and psychology. And she even worked at the Seattle Police Department for a bit, but had to be let go because of her nearsightedness, supposedly. And then she went into the crime writing field. She wrote for a very sort of pulpy, sensationalized magazine called True Detective, writing these true crime stories, and also had some of her work published by more mainstream outlets as well. And then, she herself ended up at the Seattle Crisis Center, working right alongside someone who was, I think, a couple decades younger than her, Ted Bundy. And one of the interesting things that she even admits to in her book and sort of just casually drops is that even before their alleged first meeting in 1971, that she and Ted Bundy had often lived in the same states at the same time as each other, not just once, but multiple times. So they just happened to be in the same area multiple times after each other, and yet allegedly never crossed paths until then, which is a rather curious correspondence, and has led many people to have a suspicion that Anne Rule may have been one of Bundy's handlers in a certain capacity. Whatever extent that is true or not really is probably almost impossible to prove, but it's certainly an interesting and worthwhile thing to bring up about Bundy's history nonetheless. Now, anyway, while he was in the middle of his psychology degree, he was in contact with various doctors, people in that field to do certain research projects for them. one of the things that he came at least in close association with was this institution called Camelot House, which was this sort of experimental school for quote unquote retarded kids. This was a project that a couple of people in the UWash psychology department were working on. It was founded by a Dr. Sandy Martin and then taken on by a Dr. Scott Frazier. There was one account, incidentally, there was one account in Seattle police documents that Bundy actually worked on a project for the Camelot House founder, Dr. Sandy Martin, alongside a girl named Linda Healy, who would later become one of Bundy's first victims in Pacific Northwest. Now, whether that's true or not, it also confirmed that Bundy did work for Dr. Scott Frazier. Basically did a research thesis for him. And while he was doing this thesis, he was advised by another person in the psychology department, Dr. Patricia Luneborg, spelled Lunneborg. And later, Patricia Luneborg, when she was asked about Bundy, would basically say, there's no way Bundy could be involved in these murders. She was pretty adamantly sticking up for him, saying he was falsely accused. And, according to one witness, Patricia Luneborg had a great interest in Ted Bundy's career, whatever that means. But she appeared to be Bundy certainly got very close to at least some of his psychology professors at the University of Washington. Patricia Luneborg was a member of the American Psychological Association, an organization which I should note has been alleged to have been pretty much co-opted long ago by the CIA as part of their goal to both dominate the sort of mind control research, but also to change the narrative about memories and about child abuse, to introduce concepts like false memory syndrome and generally discrediting witnesses to these horrible things that happen to them. So she was part of this organization, the APA. She was also very interested in women policing, and she was part of the International Association of Women Police, so had a law enforcement association as well. Now, anyway, Bundy Bundy was pretty much finishing up his degree by 1972, and over the summer of 1972, he actually worked, ironically enough, as a mental health counselor at Harborview Hospital, which was run by the University of Washington. And during this time, he was alleged to have been involved in stealing a number of patient files, that were patients of a Dr. Jim McDermott. So Bundy was allegedly involved in a major breach of, patient privacy while he was supposed to be a counselor to these people. So, once again, he's very close to a lot of sensitive stuff. And but what makes it particularly interesting is that Jim McDermott was actually at the time running in the Washington gubernatorial primary. He was running the Democratic primary against Albert Rossellini, and then at the same time, Daniel J. Evans was running as a Republican candidate. And Bundy in 1972 would get his next sort of major break in the political world, that he was part of the re-election campaign for Dan Evans, and as part of doing so, he was working as a spy on the opposition. Pretty much admitted, officially acknowledged even, that he was literally a spy. He would go to Albert Rossellini's campaign functions and pretty much be recording them. I think at one point even was documenting some kind of extramarital liaison that Rossellini was part of. Basically was doing his part in a very clandestine intelligence type way to help ensure Dan Evans' victory. And of course, the fact that Bundy happened to get involved at the Harborview Hospital and then steal the psychological patient details of people who were counseled by Albert Rossellini's primary opponent raised another question about the level of which Bundy was potentially acting as a rather unethical, deep cover type of spy on these political campaigns. And his theft of these files really never talked about any other chronicles of Ted Bundy's life. You won't really see it in the true crime books, but it's right there in black and white in the Seattle Police Department documents on the case. And I want to give another shout out to the YouTube channel Aryan Empire's Infinity for being the first individual to spot this in the police documents. But anyway, yeah, Bundy assisted in the re-election campaign of Dan Evans, and then after that, he the next year became a special assistant to the state Republican chairman Ross Davis. It was at the level where he would go to dinners with Ross Davis. He would even get to babysit Davis's children. So he was very much in at that point. Bundy was well on the fast track to, political connections, and one has to think that his life could have even gone to the level of he might have ascended into politics himself if his life had taken a slightly different tack. And in any event, at around that time, Bundy began to get an interest in following up his education with a law degree, and he ended up applying to the University of Puget Sound, and a major factor in getting into law school really was the fact that he had these politically prominent figures in the area sticking up for him. So he got into Puget Sound and started to pursue a law degree there. But of course, he would basically barely attend any of his classes. His mind was clearly preoccupied elsewhere. And one of the final sort of interesting things about this time is that when Bundy began his schooling out there in 1973 at the University of Puget Sound, he roomed with an individual named John Edward Muller, who was had a private security guard license and also happened to be working security on behalf of the State Department. He was down in Australia, providing support to Operation Deep Freeze, which is the mission to Antarctica, which is very sort of interesting role for him to be playing. And one friend of John Edward Muller actually said that his State Department assignment may have possibly been a CIA assignment. So Bundy was at the time rooming with someone who was close to the intelligence community and possibly even working directly for them at the time. That's right when he's beginning his law school career, and right at the time before his first murders attributed to him are officially about to start.
Yeah, that is absolutely fascinating. Well, do you want to take us through that then, when Bundy began his killing spree and his other adventures in the Northwest during that time?
Sure, yeah. There are a lot of rumors about people who Bundy may have murdered prior to the first ones that are officially recognized, including some of the ones that Jan Le Carre claimed Bundy related to him. But in terms of what is absolutely confirmed, the very first murders that can really be linked to Bundy all occur in 1974, starting at the beginning, with the aforementioned Linda Healy, who was a student at the University of Washington, a fellow psychology student alongside Bundy, who worked at the Camelot House place that I mentioned. And she was murdered she had shared a house with multiple people, and whoever broke into her house supposedly was able to get there quietly, go through, not make any noise, not get noticed by anyone else in the house, and then was able to murder her, beat her to death, without anyone noticing at all. So right then and there, and you already have the appearance of some kind of very practiced professional operation going on. There was no witness to any of what happened. There was no possible way to identify a killer. The person, whoever did this, was basically a ghost. And that pattern would pretty much continue on for a number of these other murders. Starting in the first half of 1974, there was just an epidemic of young women, college-age women in the area turning up murdered, and it was pretty much the same kind of pattern that led investigators to believe there was a connection. But in terms of actual evidence that they could get in any of these cases, there was very little that that could really be found out. In total, there were, I believe, eight. I think, no, yeah, 8 women who were all murdered in this area, all in the span of February 1974 to July of 1974, and all of these murders would ultimately be linked to Ted Bundy, though he was never charged with or convicted of any of them. Now, there are a couple. One of the common themes that was seen in several of these killings was that before, some of these young women had been in the company of a man who was wearing a cast, sling on his arm, was appearing to be injured. That was sort of the last sighting that some people had of them. But of course, there were also just instances where these women just vanished completely and no one saw anything at all. So but that was really the only clue to go on the whole arm casting, which later would become one of the sort of archetypal things that people remembered about Ted Bundy's apparent MO. Now, one of the murders that there actually is some reasonable amount of greater information and insight on actually sheds a whole lot of light on what the whole phenomenon of these missing and murdered women may have been about, and that is the case of Donna Gail Manson, who disappeared on March 12th, 1974. She was the victim after Linda Healy. And Donna Gail Manson attended the Evergreen State College in Olympia, Washington, the state capital. She was a fascinating person for a number of reasons. She was very interested in occult-related topics, like magic, alchemy. She was very fascinated by death in general. There was one anecdote that somebody in police files, had related that at one point on the campus they were showing some movie about death in one of her classes, and she was upset that she had to miss that movie. And her interest in these sorts of topics extended to actually getting involved with people in groups that really pursued them quite heavily. According to Ann Rule's book, there were pamphlets in Donna Gail Manson's room for this organization called Thought Power Inc., also known as the Institute of ESP. Now, for whatever reason, Ann Rule did not get the correct name for this. It actually turned out to be the Institute of Insight, as confirmed by the police files on Donna Gail Manson's murder. But in any case, this sort of institution, the Institute of Insight, was a rather weird one. It branched off of this organization, this larger nationwide organization called Silva Mind Control. There was some kind of split over it, and of course, Silva Mind Control is all about this idea of using the power of your mind to manifest into the real world. And there are some accounts I've seen, I have to dig them out again, that Silva Mind Control is being used in some kind of MK Ultra type thing to create super soldiers. But in any case,
I think Adrena Puharic had actually been interested in the Silva mind control method, but don't quote me on that.
Yeah, that is interesting. And I feel bad for not having that on hand. But yeah, I'm pretty sure that Silva Mind Control absolutely has come up in this kind of context before. And this Institute of Insight that Donna Gail Manson had papers on in her possession was a split off group of this. And they had all these seminars, basically their sort of course schedule was even, there was a photocopy of it included in the police files as part of their investigation. And they had all sorts of things, topics like, just manifesting your consciousness. They had stuff on astrology. They were, interestingly enough, using various theosophical terms like ascended masters. They had a logo, which was the Maltese cross, which is also used by the Orders of St. John. And they actually had a direct mention of the Cross of Malta. So, there's already some interesting parallels between this group and a lot of the things that you yourself, Stephen, have investigated for a while, and that we have both investigated as ourselves as part of the White Eagle Underground that we discussed in a previous show. And it's also curious is that one of the instructors at the Institute of Insight, 12 days after Donna's disappearance, he was down in Brownsville, Texas, teaching a class for his organization. And Brownsville, Texas is right across the border from Matamoros, which is a location where, basically it was the location of a satanic cult involved in narcotics trafficking run by Adolfo Constanzo that itself appeared to be very strongly linked to the Chicago mob and the U.S. intelligence community, and was, of course, basically a sort of hitman type group for the Mexican drug cartels. So that's a rather interesting place for the Institute of Insight to be operating. But anyway, yeah, Donna was seemingly interested in this group, and then at the same time, Donna was so interested in this stuff, magic, sorcery, witchcraft, and that she wanted to do a research project on it as part of her education at the Evergreen State College. And so Donna was told to seek advisement from a figure who was familiar to both of us and probably to many of these listeners out there by the name of Richard Allen Miller, who was at the time, the apparent Northwest Regional Director of Mankind Research Unlimited, which was itself basically an intelligence front, an apparent naval intelligence front that was doing parapsychology research, likely as part of the CIA's own efforts, like MK Often, that were looking into parapsychological topics at the time. So Donna Gail Manson was pretty much recommended, due to her interest in all the stuff, magic and sorcery and witchcraft, to go to Richard Allen Miller, who was he was on the experimental campus of the University of Washington, so not the campus itself, but a sort of offshoot building that was still affiliated with UWash. But once again, University of Washington comes up in the story, even for a woman who was not actually going there at the time. So Donna Gail Manson was very interested in these parapsychological topics, to the point where she was interested in this Institute of Insight. She was networking with Richard Allen Miller, and actually, according to one person who knew her and their statements in the police files as well, Richard Allen Miller was apparently such a magnetic and compelling person that she was considering transferring to the University of Washington because of her ability to pursue this thing with him. Now, among other things, with Donna Gail Manson, there was one witness connected her to the Symbionese Liberation Army, which is also well known as among many of these research circles as being a likely CIA plot that a man by the name of Colston Westbrook, who had served in the Phoenix program, pretty much came back. He was leading this Black Cultural Association at the Vacaville prison in California, and basically molded Donald DeFreeze, who was a former LAPD informant, into the man who would ultimately become Cinque, the leader of the Symbionese Liberation Army. Pretty much formed him into this fake black radical who was actually just working on behalf of the intelligence services. So the Symbionese Liberation Army was very almost certainly this intelligence front meant to increase public division and also demonize the black militant left. And Donna was reportedly connected with some people in the SLA, even though she was a couple states north of where the SLA's main region of operation would have been. Now, so she has a number.
Though, with Bundy's connection to Stanford, because I mean, this is all like in the San Francisco area where the SLA was based out of.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, there seems to be a decent amount of correspondence between the scene and all this weirdness in California, especially in the Bay Area, and between the Seattle region as well. And a figure that we'll get to a bit later, Thomas Creech, another sort of serial killer allegedly connected to these cults, was himself linked to the SLA as well. He, at least by his account, he claimed that he was supplied drugs by one of his organized crime handlers to deliver to an SLA safe house in San Francisco, where he saw Patty Hearst, the person who they had kidnapped and brainwashed. So yeah, the SLA is another thing that kind of shows up multiple times in connection with these Pacific Northwest area cult organizations that are alleged to be part of this. Now, in terms of Donna Gail Manson's actual fate, ultimately, although it is assumed by a lot of that these women who disappeared and were attributed to Bundy were murdered immediately, there are definite signs that Donna Gail Manson did not get killed immediately. There were multiple witness sightings in these files that show that she was alive months later after her disappearance. That there was a sighting of her in May of 1974, like I think around May 30th, with some kind of hippie type in Vancouver, so in British Columbia, just north of the Canadian-U.S. border. She was in July of 1974 seen at a party with this motorcycle gang called the Tribe. And also in May of 1974, she actually ran into somebody who ran into somebody and basically who recognized her, who later would recognize her and report this. And she said, I'm staying with a guy named Ted. Now, that's particularly interesting that she would say that, because uh, at the time this was reported in May of 1974, there was absolutely no indication that any person named Ted had anything to do with these cases. That would come about a few months later. So for somebody to directly state that this victim, Donegal Manson, was apparently in association with a guy named Ted before anyone had any reason to think that anyone named Ted was part of these cases, I think is very powerful. And it could be a coincidence, certainly, but it's a bit too coincidental for my liking, I have to say. What's also interesting at the same time is that Donegal Manson maintained a number of notebooks, personal notebooks of herself, and one of them mentions a person named, Gimli, Gimli, who had a broken hand cast. So basically, she describes somebody who was apparently using the same kind of presenting the same kind of appearance that Ted Bundy was for his reported ruse that he would use to lure in victims, which is also fascinating. And then perhaps the final witness account that really shows something strange about the whole thing is that there was one person who was an acquaintance of a man named Steve Brown, and this person who related his witness account basically said, "Yeah, Steve Brown talked about a friend from Tacoma named Ted Bundy," and basically this witness account goes on to state that there was a party at Steve Brown's dorm, that Ted Bundy was there, and there was also some girl there who had from Olympia, who they said had venereal disease, which according to the police documents, Donegal Manson did in fact have venereal disease at the time. You're not obviously not to judge her or anything. She did live a somewhat freewheeling promiscuous life, and she did have venereal disease at the time, and so Bundy reportedly, according to the witness account, went home with this girl who had VD at the time. Steve Brown basically warned his acquaintance who was giving this witness account not to associate with her because she had VD. But anyway, that's the account of basically seeing Donegal Manson supposedly attended this sort of party at the dorm of Steve Brown, and she came into contact with Ted Bundy and also other people in his social circle as well. And the same witness account goes on to talk about how Steve Brown and Ted Bundy were involved together in some sort of dope dealing enterprise, and even talks about how Steve Brown basically alludes to having committed a murder with Ted Bundy over a dope deal gone wrong. So there's also an indication in here that Ted Bundy did work with other people for some of the murders that he committed, and some of them were drug related. That's another thing that is absolutely never talked about in any mainstream chronicles about Ted Bundy. It's always that he's the lone killer and that there was no real motive outside of his own psychological deficiencies. But here you have a witness account right there in the files on Donegal Manson's disappearance, that Bundy was working with others, and that he would have some kind of drug trafficking operation going on, which is very fascinating and often very rarely remarked on. Now, what also comes up in these files in Donegal Manson has to do with another one of Bundy's victims, actually the victim who disappeared after Donegal Manson, by the name of Susan Raincourt, who attended another Central Washington State College, and she had a sister named Sandy Smithson, who later was working on the Thurston County, reserves for law enforcement, and also had a security job at the Evergreen State College a decade later in like 1984. And Sandy Smithson also claimed to have ESP herself, which is parallel to the interest that Donegal Manson was talking about and was interested in pursuing. So it is rather curious to see that both Donegal Manson, victim, and the sister of one of the victims both seem to have this sort of interest in esoteric parapsychological topics, for sure. And ultimately, I think it's a rarity to have so much information about any one of these victims. For most of the time, there was very little in the way of leads to go on, but there certainly is a lot about Donegal Manson that shows that she was in a world that has numerous parallels to the intelligence community, and even to mind control research that was going on at the behest of the intelligence community. And that there's a very decent chance that sort of forms the backdrop of what's going on, and also that what was happening with these women was not just direct murders, that some of them may have survived longer, that Donegal may have maybe even known Ted Bundy prior to, prior to the murder, that she may have been involved in some of the things that he was doing, whether it was drug trafficking or, mind control type things or any of these other operations. It's hard to directly infer any scenario outright, but the connection to these people like Richard Allen Miller and, the SLA, and to Bundy and supposed dope dealing enterprise, all this stuff is incredibly provocative. Now, another sort of thing that's very provocative is that is one of the later victims, Brenda Ball, who basically disappeared right after leaving a tavern in Burien, Washington, right by the Seattle-Tacoma airport. That actually corresponds with an account by the aforementioned Thomas Creech, who we'll get to in a bit more detail later. And Thomas Creech basically would talk about how he was part of this cult that ritually, abducted and ritually murdered women in the Pacific Northwest area, including at a particular location right by the SeaTac airport in Burien, Washington. So there are also, alternative scenarios and, suggestions. There was a type of larger operation, a different type of operation than just a lone serial killer going on. And of course, the level of, sort of undetectedness and apparent professionalism of these kidnappings does lend the likelihood of the possibility that this was not just one person acting alone. This was a group of people that were trained at murder and could immediately and easily control whatever situation they were in and swiftly, do away with the victim and leave very few or no real witnesses as to what had happened. And this, incidentally, was what was something that came up in Seattle Police Department files. There, the informant on June 26, 1974, who was a drug dealer. He sold hallucinogens, and he claimed that he sold hallucinogens to a cult, a local cult in the area that was abducting and murdering, hacking up these women and dismembering them. And so pretty much he told police, I'm selling drugs to a cult that is responsible for these murders. And police were at the time taking his information seriously, or so it seemed. They thought he was credible, wanted to investigate further. And so rather conveniently, I believe, something happened right a few weeks after that completely changed the narrative, changed the tone of the investigation. Up until that point, like I said, there were no real witnesses who could really identify a perpetrator. Some of them saw a weird guy, an arm cast with some of these women. Other people didn't really see anything at all. But there was no real, nothing you could really go off of on the investigation to pinpoint a perpetrator. It just seemed like whoever was doing this, they got in, got out, and left almost no traces. Now, the next two victims would disappear the next two victims basically were abducted and murdered on the same exact day as each other. And this time, unlike the pattern set before of leaving behind no real evidence, the perpetrator of the next two murders decided to commit them in broad daylight in front of numerous witnesses, and even used their real names, supposedly. And these two women were Janice Ott and Denise Naslund. So it was on July 14th, 1974, at Lake Sammamish Park. And even more curious, it happened to be on the day that the Seattle Police Department was having their annual picnic. So any real self-respecting serial killer would probably think, yeah, this is about the worst opportunity possible to commit one murder, let alone two murders in one day. But this person, whoever it is, decided to go for it. So they, kidnapped Janice Ott, who was Janice Ott was actually the daughter of a state parole board, a Washington State parole board officer. So that came from a law enforcement family, and she pretty much vanished without a trace. There was no real witness statements. She just vanished and would later turn up. Her remains would later turn up, dismembered. And then a couple hours later, another woman, Denise Naslund, ended up being abducted too. And at this point, there are more witnesses to what happened. Several witnesses did see her What's interesting is that there were some witnesses who actually saw a girl who looked like her pretty much being taken by a biker gang, and there were biker gangs in the area at the same time as these law enforcement officers who were having their picnic. They seemed rather buddy-buddy with each other. But ultimately, there were some witnesses who, although they didn't see the abduction itself, did see one of the women, Janice Ott, being in the company of this strange individual, this man with blonde hair and going by the name of Ted. And there were, I think, 8 witnesses total who saw this person who went by the name Ted. And so Ted became the prime suspect of what had happened, whoever Ted was. That's all they had to go on at the time, a name and a description. And strangely enough, the description, the sketch that was generated based on the description, almost very few of the witnesses would actually say that it was Ted Bundy. The witnesses who they considered most credible actually, did not believe that it was Ted Bundy. But nevertheless, this person going by the name of Ted, openly in broad daylight, decided to apparently grab and murder 2 women, and also give his actual name to people who were around them. And given the convenient timing with respect to the cult being under investigation a couple weeks before, it almost seems to me, and again, it's hard to prove directly, but it seems very plausible that, with the cult potentially about to be under scrutiny, that there was a sudden and sort of desperate shift to basically make it look like, this was just a lone killer by having this person act a lot more brazenly in a way that was designed to have them get seen by witnesses, and basically create this idea that this one lone nut marauder, Ted, was the person responsible. And at that point, the disappearances and murders in the Pacific Northwest that were attributed to Bundy stopped. There were other murders after that, but the ones attributed to Bundy stopped. And the cult investigation mostly seemed to have unfortunately stopped as well at that point. Bundy had his name get turned in by a number of people who, family members and friends, even Ann Rule ended up turning in Bundy's name at one point as a potential suspect. So, yeah, the investigation pretty much at that point believed very clearly that they were on the trail of one single serial killer named Ted, and that was who they had to direct their efforts to.
Yeah, and I mean, it seems especially inexplicable considering how cautious he had been at the beginning of the killing spree. The fact that, as you were alluding to, this is around the time that he was rising in the Republican Party. I mean, he had a lot of things going for him. Yeah, it just seems kind of like a baffling shift in behavior. But let's get into Ted's time in Utah and the surrounding area. But first off, let's talk about his curious and little remarked upon relationship with Mormonism.
Oh yeah, well before that, I just wanted to go into the cult a little bit more.
Okay, go for it, bro.
Yeah, sure. The thing about the cult, is that it's easy to say just in isolation, that these statements given to the Seattle Police Department about the cult, are just, one crank who could be dismissed, even though the police department did consider them credible, and that's written down in the documents that maybe it was just some random guy whose story didn't pan out. But there's actually a couple more compelling indications that there really was a cult that was connected to all of this. And the first thing actually came out in Ann Rule's own book. If you read these mainstream accounts, you get glimpses of the truth sort of leaking through. They'll never assemble the picture fully for you, but they'll give you little tidbits they couldn't totally suppress. And Ann Rule actually talks about how she was contacted by this informant who's telling her that they had recognized a pattern between the phase of the moon, and these murders of young women that were going on. And basically said that this pretty much would imply that there was some kind of ritualistic significance to the dates that the murders were happening, and therefore indicate that the people, that the person or people behind the murders was operating according to some sort of ritualistic idea. And this would have been easy to dismiss, and Ann Rule did in fact dismiss it. She was inclined to dismiss it, but what makes it really fascinating, hard to dismiss, is that this person actually predicted the date when the very next murders would happen. This was after all of the murders except for the murders of Janice Ott and Denise Naslund. And this person basically said, okay, I'm going to give you a note. Don't open it until, between July 13th and 15th. And sure enough, in that exact period that they predicted, uh, these murders happened. So this sort of this allegation, this pattern that was identified by this person wasn't just fit to the past, because anyone can come up with a pattern to explain the past. It actually successfully predicted the future, the next set of murders that happened. So right away, there appears to be some kind of ritualistic undertone very strongly, but Amiel never really addresses this any further in her book. And there is, of course, the account that I mentioned of this informant selling hallucinogens to the cult. It was actually about a year later another sort of informant statement to the same effect, and it's unclear, based on reading the documents, whether it was the same person or talking to a different officer, or whether it was a different individual filling a similar role. But it did come up again at least once in the police files. And then there's also something that the Seattle Police Department was keeping, this sort of dossier known as File 1004, which was their accumulation of occult-related activity in the area. And among other things that were accumulating in File 1004, there was, for example, they had information on Stanley Baker, this Montana serial killer who some people probably recognize if they read Maury Terry's Ultimate Evil or Ed Sanders' Book of Family. He was allegedly one of these killers for the Chingon group of the split off group of the process. But
he had like a human finger or something on him when he was apprehended, right?
Yeah, he basically was like, I have a problem, I'm a cannibal, and then he pulled out a human finger bone. It's one of the most, I feel bad for laughing almost, but it's like one of the most brazen things that you could ever say in that situation. Yeah, Stanley Baker, he was allegedly claimed he was working on behalf of the Grand Shingon, this cult leader, which was the same title that Charles Manson would also use, that Charles Manson's followers would use to refer to him. So, they had all sorts of, information on satanic activity in the area, which is very, very curious. But ultimately, there were people who were reporting stuff to File 1004 saying that they saw someone who looked like Ted, this person seen at the lake that day, who was leading cult meetings in the woods. And of course, it's unclear whether this Ted who was seen that day was actually Ted Bundy, because very few witnesses could actually make the identification. But nevertheless, the fact that this person who was seen committing these crimes, the murders of Janice Ott and Denise Naslund, being identified as a potential cult leader in the area is pretty curious, no doubt. And then there are actually more than one. There are two different serial killers at different times who have pretty much made statements saying, talking about this cult connection in a way that lines up very strongly with Ted Bundy's own, the murder attributed to Ted Bundy and those experiences. The first is a man by the name of Thomas Creech. And Thomas Creech, he was arrested in Idaho in, I believe, November 1974 for a double murder. And then he basically would spill out all these confessions saying that he was a killer, a contract killer for a nationwide organization, that he was, murdering for hire on behalf of organized crime interests, including a Nevada casino owner named Peter Simon, and a couple other handlers as well. He talked about his being associated with the heroin trafficking business on behalf of, and even implicated some local politicians, some nationally prominent politicians in this, such as Colorado Governor John Love and Ohio Governor John Gilligan and Colorado Senator Gary Hart. He actually was arrested. When he was arrested, he was on his way to Denver, and there was an informant who said that Thomas Creech was coming to murder Gary Hart, and then this was later brushed aside. Thomas Creech said this too, that he was coming to murder Gary Hart, and then later the authorities dismissed this. But an informant had independently said the same exact thing, so it's rather hard to know why they thought that this was a made-up story if it was being confirmed independently outside of Creech, but nevertheless it was dismissed. And anyway, Creech, he also said that he was part of this satanic organization, that the people who he was with would, part of the murder for hire operation was committing these ritualistic murders. And these ritualistic murders specifically took place at this house, this property in Burien, Washington, right by SeaTac, which of course is right where Brenda Ball disappeared from. And so the correspondence there between one of Bundy's attributed victims and the activities that Thomas Creech was up to, and the fact that Thomas Creech openly talked about how they were abducting young women from the Pacific Northwest to use in these rituals, and that of course matches up too with the statements in the Seattle police files. All of that lends a certain amount of credibility to Creech's claims. And in fact, he shows up in one of these news articles about File 1004, and it acknowledges that he described real individuals, people who actually existed. The place he described in King County, Washington, likely the house in Burien that he was talking about, actually did exist, and human blood was even found in one of these rooms. Now, the head of the homicide department in Seattle, Irv Swindler, basically said, well, yeah, but this room wouldn't be big enough for a satanic ritual to happen, which I am not totally sure what that actually means. And it doesn't discredit that this house was used for it, because they could have, of course, dumped the victims' bodies in a different room from where the initial murder happened. So, it's a rather strange statement to dismiss it. And Irv Swindler was himself a longtime friend of Ann Rule, and was the head of the homicide department, and was, I believe he was actually appointed to head the homicide department on the very day that Jordan Hawkins, one of these Pacific Northwest victims attributed to Bundy, disappeared. So, there's some interesting timing there too. But yeah, Thomas Creech's statements very strongly line up with the occult allegations to the Seattle Police Department, and also to what happened to Brenda Ball in terms of the being in the same area. And Creech also said that another aspect of the cult slash murder for hire organization that he was part of was biker gangs. And of course, that calls to mind both the biker gangs that Donegal Manson was said to be connected to, and the biker gang that may have been involved in abducting Denise Naslund on July 14th. And then finally,
Of course, also, I mean, for those of us who have followed this kind of material too, I mean, there have been a lot of implications with biker gangs, and a lot of the theories put forth by Maury Terry and some of these other individuals. I mean, concerning Manson and the Son of Sam killings, certainly Manson did cultivate ties with biker gangs. There were indications that it was a similar thing with the Son of Sam cult in New York. So yeah, you definitely see this reoccurring thread of biker gangs and a lot of this type of stuff as well.
Right. Yeah, and some of the biker gangs that Creech mentioned, I believe, like the Gypsy Jokers, I think he mentioned them, and they were also mentioned in connection with Charles Manson. So, and Creech himself, some of the satanic activities he talked about, law enforcement officers were interested in them because they appeared to be connected to the Manson case. One of the best article in Thomas Creech's whole ordeal is an article for We magazine. It's about OUI, from 1977 by Michael Reynolds. Is on my website CAVDEF on the Thomas Creech page, and it talks about how Creech talked about this activity in Southern California that, and even though the police couldn't find much definitive evidence on it at the time, they were keeping their file open because it was believed to have links to the Manson case. And then, of course, like I said before, Creech also claimed to have delivered this drug to the SLA at the behest of his handler Peter Simon. So yeah, Creech shows up in Creech has parallels with a lot of the stuff you see so far in the Ted Bundy case, and to a lot of the things that I've talked about regarding the victims. And then finally, a convicted murderer named Stanley Bernson. He was convicted of one murder in the Pacific Northwest. He was charged with another, both of young women. However, he was suspected of like 30 murders. He was a suspected serial killer on the same caliber as what Ted Bundy is often represented as. And according his attorney even said at one point that Stanley Bernson would make Ted Bundy look like a choir boy, and also that Stanley Bernson and Ted Bundy traveled together at one point, and actually they were associated together and maybe even killed victims together. And Stanley Bernson openly talked about that, which is rather interesting. Yet again, like with the Steve Brown story in the Donegal Manson documents, you have a very uncommon mention of Ted Bundy having an accomplice, which you very rarely ever hear about. And Stanley Bernson also appears to have been a devil worshiper. He was involved in this plot while he was in prison, an escape plot, was communicating with a number of other people Basically he was talking about this quote unquote brotherhood bound by a covenant of people who would be helping him escape. These encoded symbols in these letters that appeared to indicate satanic worship, and even and the plan itself was that would involve getting a bunch of automatic weapons and using a helicopter. Involved a pretty sizable arsenal to pull off, and that once again sort of harkens back to stuff that we've talked about in previous episodes about the White Eagle Underground and the level of weapons arsenals that they supposedly have themselves. So you see once again a parallel to the same ground that we've tread on many times before. But yeah, all these accounts, although none of them have individually prove a lot on their own, I think it's uncanny how many of them surface in this one case and all point to the same sort of thing of these murders and of Ted Bundy being connected to something much bigger and something that often has satanic and occult undertones to it.
Yeah, absolutely. And then also kind of the uncanny military presence in a lot of this type of stuff as well. But yes, anyway, let's get to the Mormons, though. That's another institution that shows up a lot in this kind of stuff that doesn't get recognized a lot.
Yeah. As I mentioned earlier, Bundy's fiance for quite a while was this woman, Liz Klopfer, who he had met in Seattle, but she came from Ogden, Utah, from a prominent family there. And like I said, her father, Dr. Russell Hurst, was a member of the LDS Church. His son, if I recall correctly, his son, Russell Hurst Jr., who was that Vietnam surgeon that I mentioned, I believe got married in the LDS Church. So, yeah, Bundy got involved with this Mormon family from very early on in the early 70s. And then later, when Bundy ended up moving to Utah to pursue law school there at the University of Utah, he did for a brief period convert to Mormonism. It's unclear exactly when it happened because a lot of accounts that you read will say that it only happened in mid to late 1975, like right after his first arrest. But there's also an account from a woman by the name of Ann Swenson who said that she met Bundy in February of 1975 at a Mormon church. So again, as with many things in this case, sometimes you hear a certain amount of minimization about the extent to which Bundy was actually involved in some sort of activity, be it foreign language study or Mormonism, and then it appears that it actually may have gone on much longer than most accounts tell you. Now, so Bundy wasn't, but no doubt Bundy was involved in the Mormon Church for at least several months after his conversion. But given his alleged connection to Ann Swenson, and of course his association with the family of Liz Klopfer, may have been involved in it for years actually. And in some of these cases we'll get to as well, there's an alternative suspect who himself has some weird connections to the Mormon Church. But yeah, this sort of thing does lurk in the background of the specter. It seems that when you enter into Utah and start dealing with prominent people in Utah, you are very likely to run into members of the LDS or splinter groups at a certain point.
And certainly when you get into some of the the more fringe sects, I mean, the fundamentalist Mormon groups, I mean, you see, again, a lot of kind of uncanny parallels to some of the networks we've been discussing. I mean, of course, you've got the LeBaron family in Mexico who were implicated in a lot of criminal activity over the years. I believe one of the schemes was they were stealing cars. I can't remember. I think it was in Mexico, and then they were funneling them across the border and reselling them. Which also could have been a very convenient way to traffic drugs as well. And of course, there was the infamous Ezrael LeBaron, I believe his name was, the so-called Mormon Manson, who also was implicated in quite a few murders, I believe something like 25 or something like that. And there were indications that some of this was sort of crime-related, possibly contract killings. And the LeBarons, up to this day, they would have connections. The branch in Mexico, that is to say, would have connections with the Nexium cult in recent years.
Right.
So there's a lot of very strange stuff about all of that. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but you noticed some similarities with some of the dates involving some of Ezra LeBaron's crimes, right, and some of the stuff with Bundy.
Yeah, that'll come up in a bit when we get to
Okay,
the
okay.
Taylor launch abduction. But also, since you mentioned the whole business of ferrying those cars across the border, I have to point out that that is a parallel to the kind of operation that Thomas Creech himself talked about. That his first connection to this cult group was actually being ferrying heroin in cars for an auto transport business, and then Henry Lee Lucas has also talked about how the initial job that he was given by by the hand of the cult recruiter was to basically transport stolen cars across the Mexican border and across the country, packed with all sorts of potential contraband inside of it. So that is a common thread that seems to come up in connection with these organized crime groups. And so it is interesting to see both these satanic cults and also LDS offshoots down in Mexico, both being involved in similar activity there.
It's not even actually just the offshoots of the LDS. No, and speaking to one of my friends who had a lot of involvement with the LDS over the years, it was actually fairly common for young Mormon men to be recruited by the church to transport cars cross country because, I mean, Mormons are very clean cut and very trustworthy and so forth. So they, the church actually kind of found a nice little niche to make some money off of that presentation and the car transportation thing. So yeah, even again with that, it does raise the possibility, especially given that you had these fundamentalist sects who typically had much closer connections to the mainline church than anybody wants to admit, doing a lot of this nefarious activity. It does raise some interesting possibilities. And I mean, to kind of put this into some perspective, you can kind of look at the mainline Mormon LDS is akin to like the process Church of Final
Right.
Judgment. And then you could kind of see the fundamentalist Mormon sects as something like the 4P movement, one of the alleged violent offshoots of the process church or something to that kind of effect. I mean, theoretically, there was a separation and what have you, but, I mean, they kind of they found uses for one another sometimes, and it gave it was in a good way for the mainline institution to keep its hands clean and just blame every kind of nefarious deed on fanatics. So
Right. The common trend, and you see that with a lot of these satanically oriented churches as well. The Church of Satan, the Process, the Temple of Set, all these things are outwardly legitimate organizations, and of course, you know, but and these cults may not be officially linked to them, but by seeding the ideology into the zeitgeist, you basically have given the tools to these people to form these organizations, given them the sort of social binding glue to create these networks and engage in this activity. And I think you draw a very excellent parallel, just as with these mainstream organizations, satanic organizations, and the cults. You see the LDS and these splinter groups that are not quite as distant from them as they would like to present themselves.
oh, absolutely. And I'll also kind of point out too, right quick, the Best Friends Animal Society, the successor to the Process Church of Final Judgment, ended up relocating to Utah,
Yep.
which is where it still is to this day. And it was only about 30 or 40 miles from Colorado City, so about maybe an hour drive, which was right across the state in Arizona. And that was the town that's, until I think just recently, was totally under the control of one particular fundamentalist Mormon sect that was overseen by the infamous Warren Jeffs. Reportedly had a series of ranches across the Southwest where he and some of his other top lieutenants would indulge with underage women and so forth, their child brides and that type of thing. So yeah, and this was all pretty open. I mean, pretty much the entire town was owned by this offshoot, this fundamentalist Mormon sect. I mean, the police, everything was controlled by it. It was almost run, like an Orwellian authoritarian fashion. So yeah, I mean, this, they really weren't even attempting to hide this kind of stuff, just to sort of give listeners some indication of how open some of this stuff has been. But yeah, I mean, it is, kind of interesting how you do have these offshoots that are engaged in these kinds of activities that can be easily blamed and keep the mainline institutions clean.
Right.
All right, so let's get into how good old Ted ended up in Utah.
Yeah, like I said, he transferred to the University of Utah for continuing his law school career. Although, of course, his actual amount of focus on law school it was very minimal then, and never really was a serious thing. Anyway, so he relocates there in right after the July murders, and goes there in August, and then not too long after that, another series of murders pick up. And once again, these are also attributed to Bundy, although with none of the murders that occur in Utah, or he's never charged with any murders that occur in Utah either, but they are all laid at his feet. Ultimately, he confesses allegedly to many of them on death row, and ultimately the cases are for the most part closed in that manner. And what you see even more strongly in Utah than you saw in the Pacific Northwest was an indication that there were quite possibly deeper motives behind some of these murders. Just as David Berkowitz alluded to with the Son of Sam cult, and just as Henry Lucas alluded to with the Hand of Death, you see an indication that there may be some sort of random senseless murders that were committed just because these people are sick and enjoy violence and the feeling of power that comes with it, mixed in with some murders that were actually done for targeted reasons. And you see that a number of these Utah victims attributed to Bundy were quite possibly killed for specific reasons. One of them being Melissa Smith of Midvale, Utah, who was actually the daughter of the police chief. I believe his name was Richard. I believe his name was Lewis Smith. And yeah, she was the daughter of the police chief, and that of course has to raise some question in people's minds about when the family member of such a prominent local individual is targeted. There's at least a decent chance that someone like the police chief is bound to collect a lot of enemies, and so of course one has to raise the question of if he was involved in anything, investigations or what have you, that may have made him a target. Again, something that is hard to prove, but also has to be highlighted as a possibility in these sorts of cases. Melissa Smith was the daughter of the police chief, and one of the weird things about her case is that she vanished on October 18th, and the day after that, Ted Bundy actually left to go on a hunting trip with his fiance's father, Dr. Russell Hurst, and what's strange about that is that Melissa Smith, according to the autopsy reports, was actually alive she was kept alive multiple days. So that raises the obvious question of how she could have been held captive if her captor left the area and no one was keeping watch over her. It almost inherently indicates that there was more than one person involved in her disappearance, and that while Bundy left, there was another person ensuring that she didn't leave. So, that the case not only suggests a possible contract motive, but also suggests that if Bundy was part of this, that he did not act alone by any stretch. And a victim who came, the next Utah victim attributed to Bundy, Laura Amy, also, and there was a similar sort of thing in that she was very clearly, held captive for much longer than just a day. She wasn't killed immediately. She disappeared on October 31st. Halloween, which is of course an occult holiday for certain groups, and she was actually suspected by law enforcement of being on her way to buy drugs at a cafe in American Fork, Utah. And this is a cafe that Bundy happened to frequent, sometimes under a fake name. And it also appears that Laura Amy had some sort of precognition, realized that her life may have been in danger, because a few weeks before her disappearance, she actually told her mother, I don't want to be buried like when I die, I don't want to be buried in a dress. And her mother was stunned because that her daughter would be talking about her funeral when she was so young and had her whole life ahead of her. And but unfortunately, she ultimately did, turn up dead only weeks after that, and her request was honored, of course. But the fact that she talked about that so soon before her death raised the possibility that she may have known, that she was in fact, a target, and that she was supposedly linked to drug distribution in some way. Also, raises the potential motive of why she may have been targeted, if that is indeed the case. And some weird things about her murder is that her body was found on November 22nd, so weeks after her disappearance. And but the autopsy indicated that she died only about a week before she was found. So that means that there are 2 weeks. She was held captive for 2 weeks, and of course, Bundy had his own life and everything in the interim, at least to some extent. So it's again raised the question of how she could have been held in captivity for so long if Bundy was the only person involved. And so once again, you have signs pointing to multiple perpetrators. And what happened about a week after that, on November 8th, 1974, is, I have to say, the clearest indication that the murders in Utah attributed to Ted Bundy were clearly the work of multiple people. This case, or set of cases, really just officially cinches it, and it is the cases of the kidnapping of Carol Duranch and the murder of Deborah Kent, both on the same day and within a very short time frame of each other. So basically, these times that I'm about to say are recorded in police documents, so it's pretty solidly confirmed as to when these things happened. Basically, this young woman, Carol Duranch, in Murray City, Utah, arrived at a local mall basically at 7 p.m. And by her account, she spent 10 to 15 minutes in the mall, shopping, doing various things. And then at that point, she ended up meeting her abductor, who was going by the name of, basically gave his name as Officer Roslin. And he basically, gave her the sort of ruse of how, oh, your car's been broken into, you need to come with me. And, she followed him and everything. And then he ultimately, forced her into his car, tried to, and then, drove away and tried to handcuff her. And, got, I believe, one handcuff on her and was trying to get the other one, but she was fighting and refused. And then she finally was able to break free from him and flee. And so right after that, she flagged down these local bystanders and then went to the police department to make a statement. Now, by her account, she spent a total of about 20 to 30 minutes with her captor. So putting these times together, it would appear that her escape would have happened no earlier than 7:30 p.m. She spent, on the low end, 10 minutes inside before meeting her captor, and then 20 minutes with him after. It's about, and she arrived at the mall at 7 p.m. It's about 7:30 when she escaped. If you go by the high end of her estimates, she actually would have escaped later, around 7:45 p.m. And given the time at which the police ultimately did take a report, which was 8:30 p.m., it does appear more likely that her escape was at the closer to 7:45 than it was to 7:30, just because of how long it might have reasonably taken. But in any case, between 7:30 and 7:45, you can pretty much pin down as when Carol Duranch managed to escape her captor, whoever it was. Now, right around the same time, I say it's about 20 miles away in Bountiful, Utah, at the Viewmont High School. There's a play going on. Drama club is doing, and the drama teacher, Raylan Shepard, reports seeing a strange man several times during that night, but the first time she sees him is at 7:45 p.m. And this man would later be identified as Ted Bundy, although there are serious doubts and even a different identification of this man that happened earlier. But in any event, she reports seeing this man at 7:45 p.m. that night. Now, Carol Duranch escaped at no earlier than 7:30, and possibly even escaped at as late as 7:45 p.m. So, if one is to postulate that Ted Bundy was both of these people, was both Carol Duranch's abductor and the mysterious man who was seen at Viewmont High School, as the authorities would later do, you basically end up with an impossible scenario. Either Bundy has to travel 15 minutes, travel 20 miles in 15 minutes, in the middle of a rainstorm, has to radically change his appearance in certain ways, just because there's I believe Carol Duranch's account talks about him having alcohol in his breath. The later account of Viewmont High School does not talk about that. His hair appeared different, so he would have to drive very fast, probably above the speed limit in the middle of a rainstorm, radically change his appearance, and also would have had to, before that point, formulate a new plan, as soon as Carol Durant got away, immediately make the decision to drive all the way out to Viewmont High School and abduct a new victim, would have had to do all of that in such an implausibly short amount of time. Or if the higher end estimate is of when Carol Durant escaped is true, it would have been literally impossible because Ted Bundy or whoever the abductor was would have been in Murray, Utah, while this person is talking to Raylan Shepard. No matter how you slice it, it ranges from extremely improbable to literally impossible that any one person, be it Ted Bundy or anybody else, could have committed both of these crimes. And yet, in all official tellings, there is absolutely no scrutiny, no skepticism. It's accepted as absolute fact that Ted Bundy abducted Carol Durant and murdered Deborah Kent, when there's practically no way it could be true.
Yeah, I can confirm this from firsthand experience. It's much closer to impossible than improbable. I was recently in Salt Lake City. For those of you who checked my blog out, I did a post about that about a month ago. And I was literally driven from the spot where the second girl was abducted to the spot where the first attempted abduction had occurred. And it took my companion and I believe, about 25 to 30 minutes to get there. And this is using the interstate, driving at over 65 miles an hour. Of course, in that era, you would have had double nickels on the interstate, not 65. So Bundy would have had to have been driving really, really, really fast. I mean, at least 30 or so miles above the posted speed limit to have any possibility of making it to this spot. So would he have been doing that after he had just failed to abduct a woman in the middle of a rainstorm? It's total bullshit. I'm sorry, but this is just, having seen it for myself, it is ridiculous.
I'm with you. And of course, as we probably get to as well, what makes the Deborah Kent case even more particularly, indicative of something else going on is that the person who was seen by Raylan Shepard, there was actually an initial identification of it as being someone other than Ted Bundy. And that was a local drug dealer in Park City, Utah, by the name of Ronald Dennis Auth. This is mentioned in the investigative files on Deborah Kent's murder, that, Park City authorities had basically, they had heard about this, the description of the guy, and they basically said, we have a guy who has a record, and we think he might be your guy. They sent him the photo and everything, and they took their witness, Raylan Shepard, and they decided to have her try to identify Ronald Dennis Auth. They brought her to a restaurant where Auth worked as a waiter, and when she saw him, she pretty much immediately resonated with her. She was adamant that this was the guy. And it wasn't just, a tentative thing. It was based on all manner of attributes of this person. It was based on how he looked physically, his voice, even his, mannerisms and the way he walked. She had no doubt that this guy, Ronald Dennis Auth, was the person who she had seen. So Ronald Dennis Auth was brought in, interrogated. He denied it. He took a polygraph. He passed the polygraph, and that was the end of it. They used a polygraph, and that was it. They dismissed him entirely. And although it is certainly hard to prove that there was some kind of protection going on there, later parts of his history are somewhat indicative of that fact, because a couple years later, in 1979, he was caught, along with a couple other co-defendants, transporting what was almost $400 million worth of Colombian marijuana on a shrimp boat, basically trying to get past Puerto Rico and bring it into the U.S. So he was no small figure. He wasn't just some kind of, local, no-name drug dealer. He was moving massive amounts of marijuana in that time. So he was a pretty big deal type of person in that scene. And what's strange about it, too, is that he got a jail sentence handed down to him by a jury. And then the judge actually stepped in and vacated his jail sentence, turned it into I think just a probation instead, which is about the only instance I think you'll ever find where a judge tried to be more lenient on a drug crime as opposed to less lenient. So that on its own suggests that Ronald Dennis Auth, the fact that the police were so quick to dismiss him and then his later treatment in that drug case, do suggest that Ronald Dennis Auth may well have lived a sort of charmed life that comes with being a relatively high-level drug dealer. And the fact that someone like him would come up as a suspect in the murder that later was attributed to Ted Bundy does certainly raise the question yet again of whether there were organized crime-related motives being hidden by the rush to lay it all on Ted Bundy.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly shades too of the, the whole thing with Henry Lee Lucas, and I mean, almost every kind of random unsolved murder they could think of being pinned on him. In the case of Auth too, I mean, I will point out Bontifith, I believe it was, where the abduction of Ken happened. It's a very affluent neighborhood. There's some real money there, and as I understand it, it hasn't changed very much from the 1970s, from the time when I was there. So, yeah, you could maybe surmise from that his clientele probably, had some money.
Right. And
certainly raises some possibilities about who they might have been connected to or what institutions in the Salt Lake City
and the
area.
Kent family itself, Deborah Kent's father, Dean Kent, was an executive at a local oil company, the Triangle Oil Company, and a company that was incidentally later sued for labor law violations. So there are, and also some of the people. I guess I should bring up a couple of these Mormon connections again. Some of the people at the Triangle Oil Company alongside Dean Kent were people with the surname of Allred. And that is the same surname that you see of a man named Rulon Allred, who was he was a member of this breakaway sect of, this Mormon fundamentalists, breakaway from the LDS group. And he was murdered on May 10th, 1977 by contract female contract killers who were working for Ervil LeBaron, who was headed another LDS breakaway sect. And so it is interesting to see the Allred name potentially pop up in connection with this too. And the other thing I had wanted to get to before when talking about Carol Duranch was that there was actually an alternative suspect to Ted Bundy who came up in connection with the case, who actually fit the physical description of her abductor better than Bundy. His name was Douglas Allen Yoakum, spelled Yoakam. He was formerly convicted in this shooting death of basically he had tried to, on I believe it was May 11th, 1977. So literally like a day after Rulon Allred's murder. Interestingly enough, he went up to this woman named I don't remember what her name was. Karen Roberson. Yeah, he tried to go up to this woman in Mill Creek Canyon and basically arrest her and basically handcuff her and sexually assault her. And this bystander then came by and named Justin Toffer and tried to stop him, and he ended up shooting Justin Toffer and killing him, and also critically wounding Karen Roberson. And he ended up going in prison. He's been there since then. He's tried to get parole, but he's never been granted parole. And he would later claim that his what he did was actually all just paranoia induced by the recent murder of Rulon Allred. He claimed that he was a weapons dealer. He was a licensed gun dealer, and he actually claimed that Rulon Allred had previously come by and tried to buy weapons from him. And then when Rulon Allred turned up murdered, he sort of had a mental break himself. So no indications of how true that stuff is, but it is certainly interesting that both these cases that happened on November 8th, 1974, they were later attributed to Bundy, do have some sort of weird apparent connections to these LDS, seemingly rival LDS breakaway groups in a way. And one final aspect of that is that this unknown person who was seen at Viewmont High School, whoever it was, be it Ronald Dennis Auth or anybody else, at one point they were talking to Raylan Shepard, and they asked her a question like, "Do you know if Brent Olson is here?" And she had no idea who that was, but one possible name I came across for Brent Olson was incidentally a member of an LDS. He was an LDS member. He went on an LDS mission. At one point, he was also from Ogden, just like Ted Bundy's fiance's family was. So rather rather interesting that you see these Mormon connections pop up again and again. With these two particular Utah cases, especially.
We kind of see shades of this network later on with Israeli Keys as well. Of course, his family had, I believe, started out in the fundamentalist Mormon sect. They then went into Christian identity theology, and by the time he became a serial killer, quote unquote, he was a full-blown Satanist. The chain of progression is far more natural than a lot of people realize, quite frankly.
And of course, Israel Keys, he was also out in none other than Washington State for much of his time. So it seems that this area of the country is a gathering ground almost. The entire Western U.S. really seems to be afflicted with this sort of activity.
And on that note, too, I wanted to say a few things here about the Salt Lake City area before we move along. But you have to kind of understand that it's really essential, well, for a lot of national security reasons, but I think especially for some of the continuity of government type of stuff. I can't remember if you got into it yet, George, but Ted Bundy obviously went to the U of U, the University of Utah, at the law school there. But this college, like the one at Washington State, was also an early recipient of the ARPANET technology. And to get into what I was saying earlier about this project based around behavioral science, it was launched by the legendary J.C.R. Licklider, who is a major figure in all the ARPANET stuff. This is from Surveillance Valley. As head of the ARPANET's Command and Control Research Project and Behavioral Science Program, Lick, as Licklider was known as in the agency, had seen how the agency struggled with the mountains of data generated by its counterinsurgency initiatives in Southeast Asia. A major goal of his work during his brief stint at ARPA was to jumpstart a program that would ultimately build the underlying system that could make computerized or computer-aided counterinsurgency and command and control more efficient. Tools that ingest and analyze data, create searchable databases, build predictive models, and allow people to share that information across vast distances. So this is something that the ARPANET was seen for, aiding counterinsurgency operations, and you just so happen to have a hub there in the U of U. Now, another interesting thing I will point out about this ARPANET program is it was named the Cambridge Project. Very funny. And yes, it was also based on an earlier program that had been used in Vietnam called Project Camelot. Very funny, too, if you're aware of the connotations that has to the Project Camelot in ufology.
And of course, Camelot House, as I mentioned before, being that
yeah, Camelot shows up a lot in this kind of stuff. It does, George. But something else, too, I need to make a point about. There is an Army base in Draper, Utah, which is very close to SLC, and it houses a peculiar unit. It is a National Guard unit known as the 19th Special Forces Group. It is one of only two National Guard units that are part of the Army Special Forces, more commonly referred to as the Green Berets. The other is the 20th, which is based, I believe, out of Alabama, but has detachments all across the country, as the 19th does. However, the headquarters of the 19th is in Draper, Utah. Now, this is significant because the 19th Special Forces Group, along with the 20th, would in theory be the group responsible for waging a guerrilla war against an invading force or restoring order to the country in the event of the government being incapacitated from a nuclear exchange or something to that effect. So essentially, it would be akin to what, say, the official or the regular Army Special Forces would have done in Europe as part of the Gladio operations. Essentially, it would do the same thing here. And it is based right there in Utah, in the Salt Lake City area where Ted Bundy ended up while he was attending a university that happened to house a node of the ARPANET, which was, among other things, a major component of a developing counterinsurgency technique that was being developed by the United States military. So, yeah, that's, certainly just a coincidence, I would assume.
I'm sure.